Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Uwe Heuser. I'm the Green Editor of the German weekly Die Zeit, and I have the pleasure to welcome you to this closing plenary, final discussion that we have, and it's going to be a good one, given the amazing people we have here, and let me just quickly introduce them. Starting with Anna-Katharina Hornitsch, the director of the German Development Institute. Anna-Katharina, welcome. We have, of course, our president, if I may call him that, Dennis Snower. Dennis, without whom this wouldn't be possible. Welcome. If you like, please sit down. Don't stand on my behalf. We have Wilhelm Krull, the founding director of the new institute in Hamburg. Wilhelm, welcome. We have Bambang Bojonegoro, and I think the lead co-chair of the T20, of the Think 20 from Indonesia, economics professor, and I think I did pretty well in pronouncing your last name. Yeah. And then finally, we have from a remote location, Arun Maira, the chairman of Help Age International, and there he is. Hi, Arun. Welcome to you too. Great you're with us. So let me sit down and start our discussion. After all, we're talking about strengthening G7, G20 cooperation in a time of great divisions, in a time of war, in a time of conflict. So this is quite a task and quite a subject. And let's see where we can go with this. May I first call on Dennis and ask him about his assessment of the current situation, given this big question, how can we bring G7 and G20 together at a time when on one hand, the West is coming together again, and on the other hand, there is growing conflict, of course, with Russia, but also in a way, in the way that we look at China.
I think there are two narratives that need to be placed side by side and for us to consider very carefully which one we should choose, because human beings are always driven by narratives. One is we have a big conflict between Russia and the West, or between democracies and autocracies, some other dichotomy, but those are the main ones. And the other is we, as a human community, have now come face to face with the possibility of nuclear war, the possibility of biological and chemical weapons being used, something that undermines the whole foundation of our existence worldwide. That can be used as a catalyst for helping everyone to understand that with regard to some big global problems like climate change, we, and that's the other narrative, see ourselves as part of a common humanity coming from many different stages of development, many different cultures, religions, nations, but nevertheless a common humanity that must deal commonly with common problems.
Anna-Katharina, of course, the G7 is in a way the industrial countries, the old industrial countries, and the G20 adds in the biggest, in the broadest sense of the word, the developing world, the southern hemisphere.
Is there really a rising division between these two groups?
Well, I think it depends. One has to, I mean, first of all, the G7 is part of the G20, and I think that is important to emphasize, especially at the moment. Also, the emerging economies that are coming together besides the old industrialized countries within the G20 are indeed the big emerging economies. That's where the music is playing in many, many ways. With regard to global climate change, with regard to social inequalities, with regard to demographic change, with urbanization processes, digitalization process. So basically with all global megatrends, and that's where our future is in many ways decided upon. So I think regarding your question, we have to carefully ask ourselves what kind of narrative we want to contribute to. And I think we need to pay attention to contributing to uniting narratives, as also emphasized by Dennis. And the G20 is the place to do exactly that.
Bang Bang, may I ask you, which bridges could be built right now to counteract the divisions we see?
You mean between G7 and G20?
Yes.
Yes. Certainly, first, the idea that actually written behind us, there is T7 and T20 at the same forum. I think it's a good start. It's a good beginning, promising beginning about how to reduce possible differentiation between G7 and G20. And then, of course, between G7 and G20, there are common interests. And certainly, one single interest that will be put both in G7 and G20 is about economic recovery. And somehow, our recovery cannot be just regular recovery, trying to go back to our economic performance prior to the pandemic. We are talking about the future recovery that will have different characteristics. The characteristic that will emphasize on inclusivity, on sustainability, as well as resiliency. So that's why with this kind of principles, both G7 and G20 should address some issues that really bothering all the members, G7 and G20. First of all, we are talking about supply side disruption that now even worsen, not only because the spike of demand due to the recovery, but also because of the war. And secondly, we are talking about the common interest, of course, in the energy transition and mitigation of climate change, in which we understand there is a, I think, significant gap between the ambition of all G7 members with the ambition of the G20 members that are not part of the G7. And again, the third issue would be on the digital transformation. Of course, everybody enjoying the digital use for our life, especially during the pandemic. But we also realize that there is imbalance in digital business, in which the G7 will represent so-called the big producers, while the G20 will represent the majority of the consumers. And somehow in this digital world, there is kind of discrepancy between producer and customers, meaning that producer will gain a lot, while consumer, of course, they will enjoy. But at the same time, they have to spend quite significantly in order to get the service from the producers. So those are the areas in which I think G7 and G20 can be in the same level of playing field. Yeah.
Wilhelm, it's very difficult to imagine, for example, global climate control without China. So saving the world, you need the Chinese in a way. At the same time, the narrative says these days, especially from America, that China is sort of the systemic opponent. And this century is going to be about who is going to win out, the democracies or the other regimes. That cannot be the right frame of mind, can it?
No, I think it became clear at this meeting that instead of dividing the world into three parts, you really have to come up with a kind of multilateral approach that includes China and that tries to develop policies that really meet the challenges ahead. And of course, at this meeting, the Ukraine war was, of course, at the beginning dominating the debate. And the German word Zeitenwende came up all the time. But then, of course, gradually, and particularly today, the Energiewende came back in. And so it's quite clear right now that we have to find an integrative approach. And an integrative approach is also guiding us at the new institute, so that we bring together also intellectuals from China, from Japan, and other places, and that we, I should say, work our way towards symmetric partnerships. And I think that's really something, particularly with respect to the developing world, the G20 have to do. The G20 have a particular responsibility because, you see, if you look at the figures with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, these G20 account for 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So if we do not take on this challenge of meeting the climate crisis together, then we're losing out in the long term, and that would be a real matter of concern to all of us.
Arun, maybe you can help us with a perspective from one of the very big players, India, and the question whether there can actually be cooperation on issues, on important issues like climate change, when at the same time there is a rift between leaders with Xi and especially Putin. Is there a different level on which you can still cooperate?
Thank you, Uwe. We are in a moment of crisis, as Dennis has put it, and crises are occasions for going different ways. And the problem is, as Dennis put it at the beginning, and I can see it in the remarks of the others already, the need for cooperation, a new strengthening of cooperation amongst countries who will be treated as equals and feel that they are being considered as equals. So this crisis between democracy and autocracy, which is the way it's been framed in the context of the Ukraine crisis, actually is a good way to look at what needs to change. We want every country to be democratic, and we expect that even a democratic government of a country must not become autocratic with respect to any region within its own country for grounds of security or whatever. So we want democracy at all levels of the system. So above the nations, where we have to unite the whole world, we haven't yet developed democratic institutions, an inclusive democratic governance infrastructure. That infrastructure on the top is still not democratic. Democracy would mean that whether you're a small country or a large country, you have an equal say, like democracy says, a poor person or a rich person's vote is the same. But the decision making at the top table of global governance is not run on democratic principles. It's run on the principle that those who are the largest have the largest vote, in fact, indeed have a veto and can change and walk out of agreements if they don't like how the agreements develop afterwards. So we would have to sit back and look at, rethink the architecture of global governance. And the G7, G20 are all pieces within it. There's the United Nations, we had the WTO, all institutions that have evolved after the Second World War, when, there were horrible bombs dropped, nuclear bombs against civilians, and we said, never again, we shall have peace. And so let's create, global cooperation amongst all nations. So these institutions that came up since then haven't been democratically organized nor democratically run. So you got to face up to it now. That if you're going to handle issues of climate change, which also must be handled fairly, there are historical responsibilities and emerging needs. How will decisions be taken which are fair to all? And this goes to many other matters like reframing the trade issues and more equality in terms of the needs of all being equally considered in saying let's be free and equal in trade. naturally everyone can't be equal. Those who already are large will have a greater power in taking up advantage of opportunities that free trade opens up. So matters about justice, principles of justice, in which, as I say, everybody has an equal right, though they may not have equal powers.
Bembeng, before we get more into potential new structures and forms of cooperation, I have to ask this. How afraid are you about the next G20 summit, which luckily is still some time away, but can we imagine the 20 heads of state being together in one place?
Yes, actually, that is talk of the day in Indonesia. I mean, of course, we are excited about the G20 itself, but at the same time, there are a lot of questions about the participation of several head of states. Although I think the spirit in Indonesia as current president of G20 is how to keep G20 intact. I mean, we are trying to get everybody on the table, and of course, as a leader at that time, Indonesia needs to show the leadership that G20 has to be there, G20 has to be intact, and G20 has to be part of the solution to the global problem. Of course, one of the problems is the war itself, but we still have even a bigger problem, the pandemic and the recovery after pandemic. So I think, of course, it will be up to our president, our foreign ministers, but at the end of the day, Indonesia doesn't want to lose the momentum while we are the G20 president. So again, the key words is how to keep the G20 intact and being part of the global solution.
Dennis, the American president voiced his opinion twice now that he thought that one other leader of the G20, i.e. Putin, shouldn't remain in power. Can an organization or can a cooperative platform like the G20 survive this kind of attack?
I think the G20 has no option but to survive. And to survive on the basis of an understanding that ultimately, if we want to solve any global problem, we will have to do so on a global basis. If the problem is truly global, like climate change, then we will clearly have to do it on a global basis. And what Arun has just told us, there are two important points that I'd like to bring out. One is that the decision-making that gets us there has to be inclusive and fair. And that doesn't mean that everybody gets their way, it just means that everybody is involved in a decision-making process that is considered inclusive and fair, and then is obligated to abide by the conclusions, not all of which one agrees with. And the second point that he made is equally important, which is that we need a nested system of governance whereby what happens at the transnational level is mirrored at the national level and regional level and local level, and very little is being done to provide this micro-macro consistency.
Well, you could even argue that within the EU, that is not really the case. So definitely not within the G20 then, right? It's very difficult to put these structures into place. Wilhelm, one obvious task where G7 and G20 could come together is bring an end to this terrible war. Is this a task that could unite, let's see, the G7 and the G19?
You're already addressing it, the G19. So the really big challenge these days is, of course, how to end the war, first of all. And let's hope that the current talks will finally lead to the meeting envisaged between let's say, the Russian leader and the Ukrainian leader. But that will not solve the problem of rebuilding trust. And I think that is something that will take time. It can't be that just by saying hello again, you can continue as usual. But I think there is an opportunity, and maybe it always starts, in my experience at least, with intellectual exchanges among think tanks, among academics, so that you try to rebuild trust gradually, and then hopefully you can also then start, let's say, opening up again new opportunities. My own experience, by the way, when I was still working for the Max Planck Society with respect to China, was exactly that you have to, first of all, build this kind of connection between researchers from there, have personal exchanges, and then gradually you can rebuild things. Whether that's going to work after this disaster in Ukraine is, of course, another matter. But as Samuel Beckett once said, ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. But finally to then get around it and solve it.
Let me just add one question there. A story that's being told about the Chinese experience is that the West, by opening its capitalist system on a global scale, helped China perform this economic miracle of the last 25 years. And in return, they got not an opening up of the system, but rather a closing down. What's wrong with that story?
Well, I think maybe we, in a way, also were quite naive in assuming that economic progress and technological progress per se will solve the problems. That's why an institute like the New Institute wants to really rebuild this whole thing by integrating the humanities and social sciences, by bringing them back in under the heading of we have to somehow conceive a new enlightenment, which is really also taking the global perspectives from the East as well as from the South into this new concept, and then to rebuild trust from there. I think that's the only way of finally opening up the debate again.
Anna-Katharina, do you think that science, common research, common scientific basis for solving problems can be a basis for bringing the divided world of the G7 and the G20 back together?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I worked in the marine sciences for a number of years, and the marine sciences definitely contributed also to building trust across the divides between East and West in the 1990s and then early 2000s. So we've got a historical experience here to learn from. And at the same time, I would say that the political step towards each other is needed first. I mean, obviously, the aggression has to stop, and only then the political steps towards each other can start, and the scientific community definitely has a role then to play within the field of science diplomacy, if you want to say it like this, to build trust between different societal groups across the various divides. But the first step lies still ahead of us.
Absolutely. One effect of the current war, but also of sort of the general global economic development right now, is a big burden on, for example, African countries, where food becomes almost unaffordable already, wheat, other imports, and hunger is basically on the way. Is there a role of the G20 and the G7 in bringing solutions to this sort of secondary crisis, if you want?
Yes, definitely. I mean, at the moment, we observe, as you've said already, the prices have increased around 70 to 80%. And what we also observe, and that's very worrying, is that the systems, the subsidy systems for bread prices, for instance, in Egypt, for example, are crumbling because it falls together with the debt crises and the situation of, well, we can't even say post-pandemic situation, but the situation we are still in. So we've got already the dynamics developing between a number of different crises that reinforce each other. The role of the G7 and the G20, of course, lies here in preventing that speculation contributes further, building, investing into now through humanitarian aid programs that help in the short term, but also, and that's especially the responsibility of the G7, not to forget the mid and long term. The investments into actually building up social security systems, systems that enable the stabilization for a longer term and increase the resilience of the societies.
The word Egypt already was mentioned, Arun. How does all of this affect the outlook on the COP27 and the global climate control movement?
Yes, I would again, look at it. How would it impact it? Would it induce us to create a more cooperative global governance or not? Actually, the whole climate discussion is also in the same track, where the poorer countries are saying that, look, we need some space to, to grow the incomes of our people. And so we may be using more energy per capita to improve productivity and the conditions of living of our people than before. So we can't cut down. We're going to consume more per capita. And since the populations are larger, our overall consumption and you're putting carbon into the air may be larger. So, we come back to, again, matters of equity and justice. So I would like to just come back to the questions of governance. And in the crisis right now, there was last week in Dubai, I gather, Heritage International was attending a humanitarian conference in the context of the Ukraine crisis, seeking financial support and cooperation to help the migrants, the people distressed in Ukraine and coming out of Ukraine. And apparently, majority of people there said, the winter is very severe in Afghanistan, it's very severe in Syria, and people there are dying, and they are dying because a weapon of mass destruction, which is financial and economic sanctions, have been imposed on those countries. And it's masses who are dying by a weapon that has been used to, put in line a power that was considered to be autocratic or not democratic. So we come to the governance of the world and the weapons and the means that can be used to ensure good, just governance. So in that regard, we talked about China, I heard just now. I think since the last 30, 40 years, we've just overdone combining two things together, introducing two things together everywhere. Free markets with the principle of property rights and free flows of capital and property rights. And the other is this idea of universal franchise and democracy. And they run on different principles of governance. The free market, the capitalist principle runs on the person who has a property right has larger property has a greater right in the decisions regarding the governance of the system than who has less. So in a company, those who have more shares certainly should have, it's fair, a greater say on how the resources of the company should be used. But you come to democracy where human rights count. A poor person or a rich person has an equal say in how the system will be governed. Their country, the system will be governed. So these two principles start to clash. And when the free markets get in, those who already have capital or can get access to capital from outside globalization, they become, through a process of natural cumulative causation, even wealthier. And the others who see then that they are not able to grow that fast, they may be getting better off. So you get unrest. You get then the feeling that we cannot tolerate this system. And that begins to show up against capitalism. And so we get all around the world, even in the United States, that we've got to become more socialist. We've got to bring down the people who have made too much wealth, too much, well beyond their own needs. And they've done it legally. There's nothing illegal about it. So that the legal principles on which we are governing our economy and our society are out of sync. And so Dennis keeps talking about, recoupling society and economy. The economy, the capitalist economy is run on a different system of fair governance than society, a democratic society is run. So I'm saying, once again, this won't happen overnight, but once you recognize the architecture that's required, the chances then of all these incremental steps that we're taking us at least on the right course, rather than every step that we take, zigging here and zagging there, and we keep remaining in the same condition of broken global governance.
Dennis, help us at this point, please. We talk about environmental and social transformation. We talk about a new economic understanding. In an optimistic scenario, what can be a common basis for these two circles that we talk about, G7 and G20, a project to work on?
I think we should go back to recognizing the most fundamental human needs and see to what degree they are satisfied in different countries. One human need is social solidarity, embeddedness within your community, family, and so on, nation. The second human need is agency, empowerment, the ability to shape your future through your own efforts. A third is material gain, prosperity, to be able to cover your material needs. And a fourth is environmental sustainability, to hand on to the next generation as much as you have received. And those communities where all these needs are satisfied, they're doing quite well. And our problem has been to focus entirely on the economic, the material needs. And we have put together data on all these different aspects, and find that countries that are growing nicely will have solidarity that is falling, or an agency that is stagnating. In fact, we saw this in the United States 2 years before Trump was elected to power, and 1.5 years before the Brexit referendum. And so, therefore, instead of drawing the line between democracy and autocracy, look at the satisfaction of these needs. And doing so will help us get out of this crisis where we are driven by grievance and vengeance and payback, and more focused on the needs that we all have in common.
Can an autocracy be good at balancing these very important issues?
Autocracies are terrible at empowerment. Absolutely awful. They, under certain circumstances, can create some solidarity. They can certainly create material wealth. They have often been terrible for the environment, but it's mixed. The fact that all four needs need to be satisfied means that autocracies have a problem, but we must be very careful on how we define autocracies. And if I could just say one last thing, and that is that Russia was advised to go to democracy as defined by elections, majority rule, and capitalism defined by voluntary exchange and property rights. And it got gangster capitalism, and everybody felt betrayed. Does that lead to a satisfaction of these needs? I think not. And so drawing the line between democracy and autocracy misses a lot, to my mind.
Wilhelm, you probably agree with this last sentence, right? And
not so much with the last sentence.
okay, here you go.
You see, if you look at Europe even, the tendency towards autocracies, like in Hungary or in Poland, they limit the freedom of the people, they limit academic freedom in particular. They've even led to the emigration of a whole university from Budapest to Vienna, lots of other things already in Europe, let alone in other parts of the world. And particularly, Dennis, when you mention empowerment, I think it's critical that we need a free and democratic society. Otherwise, you see, the people will never get involved. And as far as I can see, it's a matter of really discussing objectives and values. And you've yourself been committed to that as well. And already next week, we jointly will have a workshop focusing on how do we bring our values into what we value, measuring prosperity, defining well-being. These are the crucial agendas which, Dennis, you yourself brought up. And that's why I think that's something where I see a really strong intellectual bridge between the New Institute and the Global Solutions Initiative, and also combining the forces of the G7 and G20 in the same direction. And at least at a meeting this lunchtime for the Council on Global Problem Solving, also initiated by Dennis Noah, we were very confident that there is an opportunity right now to think beyond the current problems and to avoid all the traps of linear thinking. You see, right now people say, oh, we have to focus entirely on military and security issues, but it's not. It's, of course, a burning issue right now, but if we base all our policies on the moment, then we are on the wrong track. I think we have to keep track of those things that were already there for quite some time. And this year, for instance, we will commemorate 50 years of the report Limits to Growth. Yeah, and that shows you that there is a lot to do and that often it's very slow to make progress. But I think that's worth fighting for still after 50 years.
Anna-Katharina, in this big global debate that we have right now, you can also say there are two standpoints. The one says that yes, there are universal values of freedom, participation, and also positive social impact. And the other side says no, there is you can't try and impose these values on anybody. Basically, in a way, anything goes. So what's the more constructive attitude? Should we strengthen, should we insist on these universal values, which are not Western democracy, but kind of lean towards democratic values, or should we not?
Well, I mean, first of all, we've got a UN Charter, which is an internationally discussed and negotiated and agreed on charter. And we've got human rights that were also jointly negotiated and agreed on. And I think that gives us a normative compass to work with as a world society, and also a common ground to then explore further how these are basically being operationalized in different cultural contexts, in different regional contexts, etc. But they have to be obeyed, basically.
Ben, may I ask you, how do you look at this issue of so-called universal values? Do we need more of a discussion on it, or should we avoid it?
I think we need to discuss more, but with the understanding that there could be some basic characteristic that could be different from one culture to the other, and also from so-called one part of the world to the others. So, for example, Asia and Europe, or Asia and Western world. Clearly now everybody says that East Asia or Asia Pacific is the source of the economic growth, of global economic growth. While in the previous period, maybe the same will be said for Europe and US, North America. So it means, since those two areas, I mean the Western world and Asia, have potential to become the source of global growth, there has to be some common characteristic why they can be in that position. But at the same time, the way to achieve that kind of performance could be different from Western world and from Asia perspective. So that's why the discussion about the universal value needs to be continued, but one has to understand that something that might work well in Europe might not work perfectly in Asia. And of course, it's nice to learn why the Europe way doesn't work in Asia and why Asian way doesn't work in Europe. So that's how the discussion should be shaped.
Sometimes we have the impression that the Europe way doesn't even work in Europe, but that's the difference. We're almost at the end. You guys, I know, can be extremely brief if asked. So here's the last round. Your assessment in 10 seconds, or your prognosis. How is this year going to end? Are we going to end with the G20, the COP27, still more than half a year away, on a positive note or not? And we start with Arun. 10 seconds, Arun.
Anything that you want to predict, I have to say, if we do something this way now, then it's more likely this outcome will come. If we do something differently now, then I can predict another outcome. And I'm saying that if we start a conversation now, the way Bam Bang put it, then let's listen to each other. We have different carings, maybe fundamentally the same values, but we express them differently, and we would apply them considering a context differently. So please, let's honor and respect each other and give each other space democratically to find our own solutions and support each other, and not impose that I can authoritatively impose democracy on you, my version of democracy. That is not democratic anyway.
Okay.
Let's listen before we do.
Thank you, Arun. I'm going to continue my search for some optimism at the end of the year. Wilhelm.
Well, let me just answer by a quote from the famous historian and philosopher from the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas. For a miracle, you have to pray. For change, you have to work. And let's work.
Okay. Anna-Katharina.
Well, I can't predict, but I do think, and I think we all know, we are in a situation where we have to get our act together and end the pandemic jointly, as well as end this war. So it's not a prediction, and you asked after something realistic, but sometimes we have to simply know what to aim for and go for it. So.
Bam Bang?
Yeah. I will be biased because I'm Indonesian, so we hope that the Indonesian presidency G20 this year will be on positive note. But at one point, I think sometimes we forget that we have the Sustainable Development Goals ratified, approved by all members of UN. And one of the goals is about peace. So creating the peace and justice, I think, should be part of the idea of economic recovery after the pandemic.
Dennis, famous last word.
I think now at this time of existential crisis, climate, war, possibly world war, we are coming to a stage where we understand the need for caring for one another with respect to global common problems. And therefore, what holds for social solidarity within a country will ultimately hold at the global level, namely that we are rich insofar as we take care of our poor. We are strong insofar as we take care of our weak.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, great members of this panel. And this concludes the discussion of this conference. And I think on at least, if not a positive, at least a very constructive note of all of you. So thank you for speaking. Thank you for listening.